Good morning. We're going back, way back to the Exodus today. It's going to be a short series. We are looking at trusting God through transitions and God's leadership through the Exodus. It's been a while since we did this. Last time we looked, this section was 2008. So, been a while. This week we're looking at Exodus chapter 15, a section from chapter 15 and a section from chapter 17. And that's encounters during the Exodus where there was water, and more specifically, the lack of water involved. And how do you deal with that? So if you have your Bibles there, Exodus 15, page 1101, 3 ones, and then 17 as well. So what are we doing? Whatever I say we're doing. Transition. It seems to be a good theme. It's always relevant and connectable. Today we start a short series. It's going to be the 4 sermons through this section. We're looking at from Exodus 15 through 18, just those few chapters. We're going to read about the Israelites leaving Egypt and heading to the Promised Land and the encounters that they have along the way and the things that they struggle with. Well, we know that they have been in captivity and that this is the Exodus out of it to the leaving. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40 says they were 430 years in Egypt. So those of you that know your math, 2023 subtract 430 is a long time ago. 1600s. What's changed since the 1600s? Anything? 430 years. So all of those generations, that's what they knew was Egypt. So this is the first group coming out with the Passover. And this is the first days of the first group coming out. And how do they do? How do they deal with that transition? How do they deal with being raised generationally knowing the Egyptian gods and just finally hearing about God? Is there trust issues? Do they trust Moses? There's all kinds of factors that lead into this discussion. So the section begins as they cross the Red Sea until they stop at Mount Sinai in chapter 19, which we read in chapter 19 is only 3 months. So 15 through 18 is a 3-month period. So keep that in mind as we go through. Each of these things happen within 3 months, one after another after another. The things that challenge them, that confuse them, that frustrate them, but yet God is still with them. Within the chapters, we'll look at 4 difficulties that they face. They leave the bounty of Egypt, prosperous, right? But why did they leave Egypt? Because they're slaves. They leave the pain of Egypt, but the bounty of Egypt, and they head toward the Promised Land. Guess what? They got to go through the wilderness, the desert. They'd never been in the desert. So all of these factors, the first 3 months, just getting going, lots of interesting things in this little bit of text. So I thought, we've talked about it before. Let's talk about it again. Life is full of change and transition. Amen? That's both a yes, thank you, and a yes, no, thank you. Not all change feels great. It can be tough. We're going to be looking at trusting God through transitions, the things that they struggle with. The first one is they struggle with the water. Next one is they struggle with food. They struggle with the manna. It's not free of conflict. In these 3 months, not only do they have no water, they have no food, but there's enemies. And then who do they trust? The wisdom. So these 4 things come up, bang, 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 in these few chapters. But hopefully we can make some connection to God leading us through transition in our lives and also transition within the congregation. There's that factor as well. Where and how is your life changing? Where and how has our congregation changed? How will God lead us from here? Transition questions are always relevant. Life is not static. It doesn't stay the same. And how do you tend to handle transition? What's the other word for transition? Change. What's another word for change? Stress. Trouble. Opportunity. Synonyms, dependent, pessimist, optimist. But that's what we're talking about. How do you deal with an ever-changing life? Just when you think you got a momentum, something changes. You've got to, what's that word, Susan? Adapt, right? You're always, just when you think you're getting there, adapt. Something you've got to change to adjust because life changes. That's just the way it is. And not everybody handles change, transition the same way. Here's a little story. In the 1780s, Ben Franklin and the Duke of Orleans sent up a hot air balloon over France. But as it descended into a farmer's field, people rushed at it with sticks, pitchforks, and clubs. They attacked it in a frenzy and beat it, certain it was the moon having fallen to earth. Why did they act that way? Did I hear that? Fear? Ignorance? Why would they rush a hot air balloon and beat it down? It was unknown. There were more concerns than there were praise. They didn't see it and say, oh, that's exciting. They saw it and said, that could be damaging. Self-protection. Change comes at us and we don't necessarily say, oh, that's going to bring new opportunity. It's what's it going to cost me? Now what? How can this hurt? Self-protection. We know even in science, not all scientific advancements were well received, right, Kira? And scientists were killed for presenting new thoughts, and some of them had to recant their thoughts. We're going back to Galileo and others, as you may recall from history, when Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and others tried to convince the 16th century, which would have been 430 years ago. Think of that. Well, that world, that the earth revolves around the sun. They met severe opposition. Galileo was forced to eventually recant his scientific support of Copernican theory and lived the last years of his life under house arrest. The class of societal opinion in science didn't end with Galileo. Scientists throughout the years have been frustrated by the inability of public to understand their understanding to keep pace with discovery. Scientists work on this and they say, here's something new, but society says, I don't want to hear about it. I don't trust it. I'm not ready for it. And that can be frustrating for those trying to advance things. The frustration is not only seen in science, but the Bible records frustration on the part of biblical leaders, people that were trying to lead, people that were calling others forward. Here's where we've been, but here's where we're going. And this is, in Exodus, physical change of land. How can leaders assist transition? If not everybody receives transition the same, and transition can seem as threatening, change can be challenging, but we're always changing, how can leadership, how can God's leadership help us in an ever-changing world? Do you see where we're going? Because there are things that are going to challenge us. We deal with the unknown. One of the hardest parts of transition is dealing with the unknown. Why would people rather stay in a place that's bad for them instead of moving on to better things? Why wouldn't they be excited about, hey, we're heading towards the promised land? Because they'd known Egypt for 430 years. That's all that they knew. They only knew where they were at and what they had gone through. And they're not necessarily excited to give up some of those benefits, even though the environment hasn't been good for them. There's a phrase that we use that says, the only constant is change. That's a good oxymoron, saying the opposite thing in agreement. Change is constant. Over the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at how the Israelites handled the change that they encountered during the Exodus. Change tends to bring celebration. No, complaint. Change tends to bring complaint. So what we're looking at in these texts is, what did they complain about? What were they struggling with? What did they take to God as they were going through transition? But did they talk to God about it, and how did God respond? We're always in transition. We are becoming older. smarter, thinner, or heavier. We change physically, we change mentally, we change emotionally, socially, and hopefully we realize that we change spiritually. God has intended us to be this, and He wants us to seek His guidance in change. How are you in transition right now? How about those around you? How can you help others understand transition? How can you help people see where God is during change, even when it's not comfortable? Hopefully these passages will be something worth discussing. So as we get through the passages, I want us to consider these questions. We're going to look at the complaint, and each week is a different complaint, something that they're struggling with. Was the complaint a reasonable one? What was underneath the concern? If they're complaining about something, what really is the root of it? How did Moses respond? How did God respond? And what can we learn from it? So keep those in mind as we get into the text. So in Exodus 15, 22 through 27, and then we're going to take a look at Exodus 17, 1 through 7, the second encounter of water within this. It says, Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. So notice where we start. Led Israel from the Red Sea. This is like just at the Red Sea, from the very beginning of the Exodus. And they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert. Notice the next part. For 3 days they went into the desert without finding water. They left this body of water called the Nile, and then they traveled 3 days with no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, What are we to drink? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. There the Lord made a decree and a law for them, and there He tested them. He said, If you, see that? And then what are the things that He calls them to do? If you listen carefully to the voice of the Lord your God, if you do what is right in His eyes, if you pay attention to His commands, if you keep His decrees, if you, then what's the I will? I will not bring on you any of the disease I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. If you, I will. Then they came to Elim, where there are 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped near the water. So that's the first encounter. Get to no water 3 days, get there, the water you can't drink. God says, if you do this, I'll do that. Then He brings them to a place with good water. Exodus 17, 1 through 7. Records a second complaint about water. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveled from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with who? Moses, and said, Give us water to drink. Moses replied, Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water there, so they grumbled against Moses. They said, Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, What am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. The Lord answered Moses, Walk on ahead of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. We've looked at a couple times in Scripture where God just says, and go. That usually just means tie up your sandals and just go. And go and I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not? Is the Lord among us or not?" So that's our text. You feeling a connection? You learning some lessons? You thinking about some things? Here's the questions. Was the complaint a reasonable one? Anybody here need water? I kind of need water. More so iced tea, but water. In the first account, I think 3 days with no water may bring up some concerns. We're walking into the desert. What are we doing? Why are we now in a place of difficulty? We were already in difficulty. Why are we doing this? It's magnified by the fact they'd never been in a desert before. They were from the most fertile place in the known world, the biggest source of fresh water. It's a big transition. So for them to say, we're not used to not having water. True. We're not used to this. We're in a new environment. Things aren't like they used to be. So what's the reaction to that? Is it a reasonable complaint? Yes, but is it still a complaint? Yes. What was underneath the concern? The bigger question could have been concerns about whether God can provide, or if God was the one to follow. Is this the best lifestyle that God could provide, walking in the desert and wondering if you're going to die all the time? The Egyptian gods did better than that. Are we following the right person? Are we going the right way? Are we trusting the right God? Bigger concerns. So how did Moses respond? By the way, who was accused? Did they accuse God? No, they went to Moses and said, "Why did you do this? And why did you provide water?" What does Moses do? Well, he looks for an answer. God responds. Moses looks out for himself, make sure he's not going to get attacked. Moses, as a leader, first goes to God for the answer. But he also takes the struggle to him. He says, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. Okay, help me to help them. How do we get through this together? You lead me and I'll lead them, right? They're following me. Help me to lead and show them who you are. How did God respond through this? He gets to the heart of the concern and says, if. See, what they're missing is relationship. They don't know God. So he reminds them, you do this, and when you take a step of faith, I'll bless it. I've led you this far, now you show that you're willing to follow. You take a step of faith, you try something, and then I'll bless it. If you listen carefully, if you do what's right, if you pay attention, if you keep his decrees. You focus on God, you focus on me. That's what God is saying. You focus on me, and I'll bring you. Are you going to look at the concern, or are you going to look at God? You focus on me, and those problems will seem different. I'm the one that can solve them. Then he brings them to the oasis. But they appreciate more by going through the bitter water first. If God just blesses them without challenge, without ownership, without accountability, it's going to be a different encounter. How else did God respond? It's like he's saying, you don't know me well yet, but you need to trust in my character. You do know that I am capable and trustworthy. You do the trusting, I'll do the taking. Does transition concern God? Is he not the God from where you left and also the God of where you're going and the God of the journey, you may be concerned, but God is through it all. God knows. You do the trusting, I'll do the taking. Do you focus on the problems or do you focus on God? We're all in transition. Transition is a part of life. You do the trusting, I do the taking. When God says, if you do these things, then those are the things we can focus on. What else do we learn from it? When you have trouble with transitioning, God looks to the heart of the matter and he does not condemn us for the struggle. Because the struggle can bring growth. If it's a reasonable question, if it's I don't know if I can, take it to God. God's okay with that because it's where he's going to lead you. As a leader, it's a reminder to go to God first and know that he is in charge and he will do the taking. You don't have to take too much responsibility here. Just ask for, lead me so I can lead others. Fits well with Galatians. How are you dealing with the transitions in your life? One of the ways to consider that is, what do you tend to complain about? What wakes you up at night? What are the things that you hum and haw about? What are the things that bother you? What are the concerns that are on your mind, that are in your heart? Take time to get to know God so that you can trust in his character and who he calls you to lead through this time. Going back to the reminder that we're both following God and leading others. People are in transition around us. If we can follow in confidence, that helps them have confidence in God as well. The importance of prayer. They needed to develop a relationship with God that they would go to God directly as a nation, but they're not there yet. Everything is reliant on Moses. But we can go to God in prayer. There were two major things that kept the people going through the wilderness. It was God's presence and trust that he would end the journey in the promised land. Trust that God has a plan and he's going somewhere. But that God is with us in the journey. So this week, seek his presence. Ask for clarity in where he's leading us. But there's also a call to keep moving. One step at a time. Struggle if you must. But God has great things ahead of us. We need to be spiritually focused. Resolved on God and his action. We can trust God with any concern that we have. God will do the taking, we do the trusting. But seek his presence. Focus on God and the worries will come up anyways, but then we can deal with them differently. It is fine and reasonable to complain about not having water. Some of those big concerns in life you just need to deal with. There's no putting them away. It's a concern that's legitimate, it's natural, it's immediate. It needs to be talked about with God. But do we do the listening? Do we trust that God has enough power to take us from where we are to where he wants us to be? So for the next now 3 weeks, we're going to look at the other encounters with God and how at the end of it, they have a different relationship because of trusting God in the transition. Next week, we're going to look at chapter 16, and that's where they complain about a little something about not having food. Well, if you know me, you know I'd be complaining too. Thanks for our time together. Thanks for those that are joining us online as well.